my background's retail predominantly, so Sainsbury's in the UK and then Coles, and always been in fresh produce. So just want to start by setting the scene in terms of the exact same slide that we looked at 12 months ago, that the industry growth is essentially half what it used to be. Last 10 years, we've been tracking around this 4% level. And really the reason that's happened is due to the growth of the major discount, the main discounters in Australia, which is namely Aldi, Kaufland, Costco. And you can see this share increasing. And that's led to this squeeze on price that everyone's experiencing. From that, we've seen that then the arrival of Amazon and Ocado. Who's heard of Ocado? A couple of people. So they're a pure online retailer out in the UK that initially started with Waitrose, have now partnered with the 8 biggest grocery retailers around the world. So Carrefour, Metro in Spain, and so on. They've got a JV in place now with Coles to build their online delivery system, and we'll look at that a bit more closely. But essentially, that's meant that how do you capture value? And that's a question that retailers are asking, and it's flowing down the supply chain to producers as well. So, going to look at the retail landscape. Talk a bit about the consumer drivers, touch upon some of the food safety aspects that I think has come up today, and then the so what. What's the future state? What's the opportunities moving forwards? So retail, no surprises here. You can see that the large retailers, the major format retailers, Coles, Woolies particularly, strong growth. The resurgence in 2018 of the smaller retailers, but you can see this gap starting to widen. When you look at market shares, Woolies tracking slightly up, but only just. Coles slightly down. The only retailer that's really in significant growth at the moment, Aldi. Yeah, as they have been for many, many years. At the expense of Metcash that are becoming less relevant to the consumer. They're starting to experience more operational deleveraging as their volume decreases, unit cost goes up, and you start to see those that play out in their market share. It's interesting when you look at Australia. This is a study from last year that Aldi is still Australia's most trusted brand. And that's not just in grocery retailer, that's across all Australian brands. So you see Aldi here, Bunnings, Qantas, ABC, Toyota, Target. You've got some massive Australian brands there, yet Aldi's at the top. And what's interesting about that is that a brand is essentially it's a symbol of trust. And when you get distrust, it leads to customer churn, it kills customer engagement, it kills supplier engagement, and it's the tipping point for reputational damage. So the fact that Aldi has maintained that position for 3 years now is quite significant. And the reaction to the Aldi effect, as Aldi's got mainstream, particularly post-GFC, consumers resonate with the Aldi offering. You've seen that the Coles and Woolies really slug it out, competing for this increased like-for-like growth. And the bit that Wesfarmers, I suppose, would be most pleased about was the 7 years here, 29 quarters, where Coles' like-for-like growth outstripped that at Woolworths. And what happened in that time was there was a huge amount of deflation that went into the market. So essentially, there's probably around about a $2 billion investment in lowering prices. So we had down that came in 2010, and you had deeper down that was about 2014. And that was unprecedented deflation for the Australian market. It'd never been experienced before. 1,650 lines, about 35% cheaper than been previously. So huge amounts of deflation. And what was interesting is this was driven by Coles. Woolworths had to react. Ironically, it probably worked to Aldi's favour in the sense that Coles destigmatised low price in the eyes of the consumer. So if you really want to shop low price, where do you shop? Aldi. So the fact you can see that behaviour is now starting to unwind, and you can see both the majors have pulled back from just putting out price communication. You can see as to probably counter that Aldi effect. Now, as I mentioned, huge amount of deflation, probably a $2 billion investment that went in. And you had these, this is just looking at supermarket margins, and Woolworths trading at about an 8% margin. I mean, that was absolutely astronomical. At the same time as Woolworths were making 8.2, Tesco's in the UK, a very reputable retailer, was making 1.9%. Okay? And this is probably what attracted a lot of the overseas retailers, Coughland as an example, to come into Australia. Australia has huge retail margins, but you can see how it's really fallen off, and both Coles and Woolworths are now trading around that 4.6, 4.7%. Still high globally, but a lot reduced from where it was previously. The interesting thing about this, though, is that as the investment in price has occurred and you've got declining sales growth, it's essentially led to this operational deleveraging. And it's meant that in order to, so the retailers are lowering prices, and they're saying, well, we're lowering prices and we're getting a volume uplift. Because we've got more volume going through the business, we're going to get operational efficiency, we'll reinvest that into lower prices. So the double loop that Roger Corbett would have been working, most retailers worked early part of early 2000s. But what it's led to is this reliance on margin expansion. So for the retailers to grow, and bear in mind the retailers' main metric performance is shareholder return, it's meant how do they get margin? And they're coming back to the suppliers. So this was just from March last year, where you can see empty shelves on both Coles and Woolworths shelves. Now, that's because they've got into this Mexican standoff with suppliers, whereby they can't get agreement, they can't get consensus. So, unfortunately, the supplier goes, that's it, I'm out, I'm stopping supply. The retailer has empty shelves. Now, it's interesting to know who suffers when this happens, because when Coke, for example, stops supplying a retailer with Coke, who suffers more, Coke or the retailer? Jenny's right, the retailer. It costs the retailers more generally, yeah? And you can see, and this has happened in the UK a lot, that you have this sort of relationship breakdown, and it's not good for anyone. So it's sort of indicative of just how fiercely competitive the retail sector is at the moment. And, on top of all of this intensifying competition, we now have Coughland coming in. Coughland belongs to the Schwartz Group, that also own Lidl, which is a very similar business to Aldi, all across Europe. Fourth biggest retailer in the world. Going to be opening up end of next year. Big box hard discounter. High fresh food focus, about 30% fresh. What's going to enable them to probably expand in Australia quicker than perhaps Aldi has done is they run 5 formats. Aldi does one format, about 800 square meter store. Everything's exactly the same. It's incredibly Germanic, it's very process-driven. Whereas Coughland, they have these 5 formats, so they can actually access space a little bit more easily. Yep. Have they really? I should have looked at the newspaper today. Have they really? Yeah. So that. Did they give a reason or not? So they've already put in $500 million into Australia with 2 sites. Yeah. Wow. So forget that. And you can forget some of the next slides coming up, but I'll show you them out of interest. That's really interesting, actually. Yeah. So what you can read into that is that given they have 2 businesses, they have a Lidl and a Coughland, and a lot of the analysts were saying that when Coughland came in, actually the better format is Lidl. So it'd be interesting to see whether they reinvigorate the Lidl debate or not. But in terms of what Coughland's expansion was going to look like, it was about this. And you have to get to to run a DC and store model, you have to have about 25 to 30 stores before you're at probably a break-even point, before you're getting any kind of efficiency at all. So you can see the investment. They've already been in here 2 to 3 years, so they probably had another 3 to 4 years before they're going to get to that break-even point. So a huge investment. And when you see how that compares to what Aldi's been doing, so Aldi came in 2001 and quite aggressively expanded. This is their percentage growth year by year of store space. You can see how they expanded here quite aggressively off a low base. But what's interesting here is that post-GFC, they really got some momentum in financial year 12 to about 17. Really put up a lot more space on what was already quite a big footprint. So around about 520 stores now. But likely to be less disruptive over the short term. And a lot of the Aldi behaviour has actually been, interestingly, modified because of the threat of Kaufland. Because Aldi and Kaufland are fierce competitors over in Europe, so they know how each other operate, and that's probably why they've just backed off a bit here to consolidate. So if Kaufland exit, the question is, will actually Aldi then get a resurgence of confidence to then try and increase back up again? That'll be interesting to plan. Well, maybe we can talk about that next year. When you add up the combined discounted market share, this really goes to that second slide, when you see that early 90s, we had a lot of discounters. Now, Australia is the second most price-sensitive market in the world after New Zealand. So the consumers here are price-sensitive. They like low price. The fact is that Coles and Woolworths, they shut down all those other low-price brands, the Bilos, the Franklins, the Food for Less, and they rebadged them to their main format, Coles and Woolworths. But actually, the consumer still wanted those low-price formats. And this really shows why these guys are going to grow, and this is why their market share is really going to get up to this sort of 12 to 14%. And I would almost say that even if Kaufland along the top here will exit, that is likely to be absorbed by Aldi, most likely. And when you consider Australia, if you look at Australia and you say, well, look, what does a rational market look like? If you have the four big retailers, how would they divide the pie to say, look, this is my bit, this is what I own? You'd essentially say, look, Aldi, they own low price, they own value. Low price, reasonable quality. Coles and Woolies, service, full format, large store, large amount of range, 20,000 SKUs, 20,000 product lines, sharing fresh with the independents that are really leveraging off local. And local relevance, I should say, and convenience. But what we've seen happen is that Woolworths have moved down here, and they've tried to take on that sort of convenience and that local IGAs. But we saw Coles under John Durkin go over to try and take that low price, the down campaign. So I want to compete with Aldi. Even though I've got a high-cost model, I still want to compete with Aldi on the low price. What we then seen is Woolworths really start to move back, and they've moved back to where they probably should be, around service, shoppability, loyalty programs. And under Stephen Kane, we're starting to see this move back from low price. So the focus on private label, the focus on innovation. You can see the Coles local stores. Coles have got some amazing new formats now that they're trialing. If they're successful, you'll see those scale pretty quickly. And the message here is really to say, look, has Coles left it too late to get back from the price position into this space, bearing in mind Woolworths are already there? Because if they carried on investing in low price, all it was ever going to do was accelerate the growth of Aldi, because they own low price. And ultimately, they've used up their war chest on investing in price, which means they won't be able to invest in the points of difference that will be critical to having a differentiated offer to the other retailers. So this is where we're at the moment, and this is what we'll see play out over the coming months. So just moving on to the consumer. Now, one of the things I was asked to talk about was just to touch upon food safety. And when you look at the classic Maslow hierarchy of needs, the basic requirements are here for food safety. Once that's met, consumers moved up to here, to here, to here, and at the top comes ethics. So really what this says is that at the foundation, consumers' expectation of food safety, it's a given. Yeah? It's not questionable, it's a given. So when we have issues like, this is a picture of Rombolo Farms, and I don't know how many people have been to Rombolo Farms, but Gavin, I know you have been. It's a fantastic business. Yeah? This is a 9 out of 10 site. Big supply to Coles of rockmelons. We saw 7 people die from listeriosis. It's really now saying that consumers want transparency, trust, and traceability. It's non-negotiable. And I've got some data here. This is Woolworths scanned sales of rockmelons, just tracking over the last 3 years. And this is going in units per store per week, by week. And we had the listeriosis recall 1st of March 2018. Now, in that 6 months following that recall, thought to lose about $60 million of sales. That's about the estimate. And the question is, and what I was talking to Wolves about is to say, well, how long does it take for this to go back up to this level? And what you can see is that, one site got it wrong, and 90% of sales were lost in the initial period. And you can see here now, that's probably, it's about a third of where it used to be. And yes, at this period here, there's probably some growers have exited the industry and probably aren't growing anymore, so the supply quantities may be down. That may have altered average price. But essentially, you can see this tail will go on for a long, long time before we get back up to the higher sales levels that we had. And when you look at the costs of these recalls, this is the recall that happened with Tripod Farms in Victoria a few years earlier, and you can see here that the recall had cost the company more than $15 million in total economic loss. So when you get a recall, it is huge dollars. Certainly at my times of Coles, I never put a recall through. I would have put maybe 4, 5, 6 withdrawals through. So withdrawals are not a food safety issue, but recalls are a food safety issue. The lowest charge back to a supplier would have been probably $40,000 to $50,000 for a one-state withdrawal. If you're going up to national, you're $250,000 to probably $1 million. Just an advert in the Sydney Morning Herald is $18,000. Now that gets passed on at cost to the supplier. It's not something the retailer's making a margin on. It's lose-lose. When that happens, nobody wins. Again, Anthony Houston from Houston Farm saying, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. Victorian grower got it wrong. I'm losing $500,000 a week. The impact of Brand Australia. These were adverts picked up in the Thai press saying, watch out. Brand Australia, don't buy your lettuce in Australia. They've got real food safety issues. What's the halo effect of that going across salad to fruit to meat to other products? Very hard to gauge. Some of you may know, I also look after the HARP scheme as well. And a video we often play in HARPs is what I'm going to show you now, which just explains another concept.
There are reports that there is no evidence of a direct link between Baghdad and some of these terrorist organizations.
There are known knowns. There are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
I'm not.
Several unknowns, and I'm just
I'm
wondering
not
if this is an unknown.
I'm not going to say which it is.
But the Secretary,
No, I'm right here. I'm right here.
So you get the point, yeah. When it comes to food safety, there is the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And when you look at what happened in strawberries, this has never been experienced anywhere in the world. I've been in Australia 15 years, and my background in the UK, which has had many, many food safety incidents and recalls and issues, never had anything like this. Unprecedented in terms of sabotage, terrorism, whatever you want to call it. There was 230 or so reported incidences, and it was obviously fueled by the media. But it went across every retailer. Harris Farms, independents, the majors, across all the fruit categories, across veg categories, across grocery lines as well. You're not allowed to report on it now. The media are not allowed to report on it to the same extent. But it was still going on, even probably now it is still happening. And probably some of the key outtakes we can get from this is just, there's a great report here, the issues management by SDA Strategic, which just summarizes some of the key learnings from this. So when we look at what went wrong, apart from the excessive media reporting and probably the failure early enough to realize that actually this was severely impacting the producers, no crisis management specialists, no containment of public concern. The failure to warn and engage industry meant growers and suppliers were unprepared, and it essentially led to the retailer saying, well, what do we do? Well, we'll probably put a recall in for all strawberries. And it was interesting because Coles recalled all strawberries, and I think Woolworths only recalled certain brands in certain states. And that was a function of how much trust they had in their traceability systems, plus how much they felt the consumers were at risk of what was happening. So a difference of interpretation. No consistent messaging or control actions. It was going across multiple states. Who controls it? Was it Queensland Police or New South Wales Police or New South Wales Food Authority? Who's taking control? Never happened before, so none of these protocols were in place. And this is what really led to the copycats, it's that 5 minutes of fame and people wanted to get on TV. What did work and what actually slowed down the crisis was the centralisation of the management, and it slowed down the acceleration of public concern. Great idea around a positive conversation with consumers to say, look, cut them up, don't cut them out, putting the grower at the centre, help the producer. You're putting people out of business. And I think the learning here for industry is to say, look, there needs to be a good issues management system in place, which is around preparation, testing the protocols, and having structured communication. Obviously underpinned by robust traceability systems. But really, that's probably the key learning that came out of this incident. And could it happen again? Yeah, sure, but the contamination is not happening necessarily on farm. So metal detectors, yeah, there may be a feel-good factor, but they're not necessarily going to solve the problem, which is consumers going into store or at home and putting needles into strawberries. So, looking at some of the consumer drivers, and I really like the statement here. The best way to anticipate change in a sector is to spend time outside of your sector, and it's always good to look at other sectors to see what are the learnings. And it all comes down to the consumer. Look at Amazon. The whole Amazon model is based around understanding the consumer, absolute customer obsession to give them everything that they possibly want. And by 2025 in Australia, these are all the things that we're expecting to see, and I'll let you read that. We'll touch upon a few of these, but really, just want to start with saying that, more and more now you're seeing consumers balance value with value. So the value of form and function versus the values of provenance, authenticity, and so on. And consumers are always making that decision. They can be quite polarized. I certainly look at where my wife shops. She'll shop in an Aldi or a discounter or a major supermarket, and sometimes she'll also shop in that top-end independent for the imported French cheese at bloody $100 a kilo. It's very polarized to people how they spend today. So increasingly, shoppers are more promiscuous today. They switch brands more readily. They switch in and out of promotions more readily, and they're not really loyal to anyone. So when you go to your store and you say, have you got your loyalty card? And you take out 6 cards and say, that's how is that loyalty? Yeah, that's what we're seeing today. One of the key things, just going to focus on 2 or 3 of these. So sustainability. This series of photographs of dead birds from Greenland and Alaska, which went viral a few years ago, just showing birds that had died from ingesting plastic. The famous turtle with a straw up its nose. It's meant that if you're a cafe and you sell plastic straws now, you're really frowned upon. All really sort of championed by this war on waste. And I think the war on waste has put the fear of God up everybody to a degree, because the consumer is much more aware, and we have to take action. There's an expectation that retailers do something and producers do something. We do not keep putting stuff in plastic if it's not relevant. You look how things have changed today, from coffee cups, the ban on single-use plastic bags, water bottles. A lot of businesses now don't have plastic water bottles in the fridge. Behaviour is changing. From a retailing perspective, I think one of the excellent examples of what Sainsbury's is doing at the moment. This is Sainsbury's commitment to sustainability. No dark plastics, hard to recycle. Pre-cycle areas where you can actually take plastic off in store and they'll recycle it there. Hard to recycle plastics like polystyrene, banned. And you can see how the other retailers everywhere around the world are making these claims. And Coles, Woolies, Countdown are no different. They're all making these claims as well. When you look at what's already in the Australian marketplace, mango trays made out of paper instead of plastic. You've got to have an Apple example here, so the pink lady box. And these PLU labels now made out of paper instead of plastic. So all these, and it's not about the silver bullet. I think it's about the 2%ers. It's incremental change. It might only be a small change, but once you add up all these changes, it's actually significant. And you can go to the consumer and you can say, look, we're doing something. We're being proactive. We are trying to improve on what we've already got. Next one is provenance and authenticity. And, you can look, any new launches have got they talk about provenance. This is a meat example, natural, local heritage, nostalgic. A lot of these apply to produce as well. And when you look at the new product launches, this is going back to 13 to 17. This is a number of years old. You look at 500 launches a year of grass-fed claims in meat. You almost can't sell meat now unless you haven't got a claim on it. Challenge perhaps is how do you get the cut through with all that noise, but you can still see how it's so relevant to the consumer. I think the one that's so relevant to apples and pears is this snacking, which is it's an occasion. Snacking is now an occasion in its own right. And it really comes down to three key occasions. One is around nourishment. It's this need for daily sustenance, and a few examples here. The second one is around pleasure, satisfying that emotional desire. And it's products like, it's the indulgence, but it's like, good taste, the distinctive flavors, nostalgia. You then get this optimization around, it's a quick energy hit, it's the protein bars, it's those sort of products. But you can see how the proliferation of snack brands, you go around the petrol convenience stores, you go around the major supermarkets, more and more space is being given up to snacking because that is how we're living our lives. And it's interesting because, when you look at how snacking changes through the day, it's quite interesting because you'll see if this is early morning here in the green, it's better for you. So we all start off going, I want something healthy. I'm going to start off with the best of intentions in the morning. I'm going to be really healthy. I'm going to have an apple. You then get later in the day and you go, you know what, I'm just flagging a bit. I'll tell you what, I won't go straight to sweets. I'll do salty snacks, savory, not quite as bad. And then in the evening, it's like, stuff it. I need my ice cream. I need my high-sugar yogurt, which has probably got more sugar in an ice cream anyway. I'm going to have that. So you can see how those occasions change through the day. And it's so important as an industry that apples, you go back here and say, well, where does apples fit? It probably fits in all of that to a degree, in every little bucket, It's how do you market that? How do you get cut through? How do you compete? You talk to FMCG brands, you talk to Mars, and they say, my God, I wish I could have the credentials that the fresh produce industry has. I remember doing this with bananas. Wow, you've got it wrapped in a skin as well. We don't necessarily make the most of it. Next one is just the personalized marketing, Gen Z. And I've only focused on this area because they are, as a segment of the population, they are so misunderstood. So Gen Z, age 7 to 22 years old. Biggest generation globally now. What's interesting, 52% find out about new products from social media, generally through influencers. And you go to Asia, Gavin, you've done a lot in Asia, it's all about influencers. That's the way you get traction. And this is a really important segment. These guys have only been alive whilst the internet's been around. It's Amazon. And unlike all of us on email and Facebook, they're on Instagram and YouTube. And self-diagnosed spending too much on their phones, which goes without saying. And Instagram's a great example. 53% in the US, 43% in the UK of 26 to 35-year-olds share what they eat online. How many times do you go to a restaurant, cafe, and people are taking pictures of their food and then sending it somewhere? Smart Labels app, technology is the enabler, blockchain is the enabler. And the question is, how do you get your products to feature? How do you get apples to feature? That's the challenge. So just want to look a little bit more closely now at the apple and pear industry. I've got a video to play, which is from a comedian, Kitty Flanagan. Considering it has got some swearing in it, but given this is the produce industry, I thought that would be very appropriate. So apologies if anyone gets offended.
I bought a bag of apples. Now, I bit into one of the apples, and get this, it was crunchy and juicy. Oh, come on. I don't know if that silence is, like, just stunned. Like, if you're just in awe. Like, I can't quite see your faces. Maybe you're just going, a crunchy, juicy apple. There'd be people in here too young to remember when apples used to be crunchy and juicy.
So that's from a few years ago now. But, when you think about why are comedians funny, they take the everyday and they make us look at it and they make us go, oh, yeah, that's true. I get that. So she wouldn't do that if there was not a perception that that was the situation of apples, whether we like it or not. And yeah, it was a few years ago, and I think that quality has significantly improved. So the fact now that we've moved to NIR on testing and improving quality, investing in orchards, it's absolutely right. Because the last thing is you don't want consumers having that type of experience. And I think it ties in so well with the marketing angle here of, the Hailstorm Heroes that I think was SA and Northern Territory, I think that was it, NT, that this went through. Really successful. And it's just sort of, consumer-facing, it's educating the consumer, it's still creating consumption, it's explaining what's going on. So it's a really kind of powerful combination. But you know what, if I was going to put my retail hat on, and I was going to say, to challenge you guys and say, well, what do I think the pain points in the industry are? I'd say it's probably this, that, this is a range of apples from one of the major retailers. There's 24 product lines. I think I'll probably delete out those 3 in red, these 21 lines. 21 products on the shelf. We're putting more and more varieties in, yet we're not taking anything out. So we're starting to create operational inefficiency. We're cannibalizing our store, our sales of our remaining product lines. We are basically putting operational deleveraging in. We're reducing stock turns. We're reducing the sales velocity. We're actually possibly giving the consumer a worse experience because the product is sitting on the shelf longer. Is that the right thing to be doing? If we're going to do it, we need to do it very carefully. So I've said range proliferation relative to range innovation. In terms of pack houses, there's so many pack houses around Australia. Are they all working to capacity and truly efficient and have all the technology that we need in there? Again, if we don't, has a stock turn implication. And then the oversupply. If we're putting in new plantings into marginal growing regions, are we at the risk of creating oversupply and not giving the consumer a good experience? And then finally, you do have this massive marketing challenge that consumers feel apples are boring. Yeah. And that makes it really, really difficult. So it's this transition from, production push of this is what I've grown, this is what we have to sell, this is what I have to buy, to the other way around where it's a pull-through, saying the consumer saying, this is what I want, this is what we need to stock, this is what we need to grow. And that's really challenging for an industry, particularly a tree crop industry where it takes years, if not decades, to achieve what has been achieved, which means it does need an industry approach. But when you look at the competition, and the competition is intensifying, just as the retailers are experiencing more competition, so is the apple category, because you've got this rivalry from desserts, whether it's chilled desserts, dairy desserts, ice creams. You've then got the commodity desserts, which are all considered relatively boring and everyday. But then you've got these categories that are really saying, actually, you know what? You look at what these categories have done. They've positioned themselves as indulgent desserts. They trade on seasonality. When you look at the things that the strawberry and berry and raspberry industry particularly has done around genetics, covered crops, season extension, cherries that really go off, using their high-definition optical graders, and they reposition themselves. We're only here for 100 days. Quick, get in. Grapes, putting in minimum maturity standards, leveraging the snacking, convenience, and impulse position, which is exactly where apples is, and where apples should be owning it. I'm doing some work with grapes at the moment, and this is interesting in the sense that grapes have said, look, we know we get some low-sugar grapes out there, okay? We know that. We know sometimes they're down at 14, 15% bricks. If we can get it to 16% bricks at 80% acceptability, we have a massive opportunity. So at the moment, they're about 70%. So this just shows that if consumers come in with a 70% acceptability in bricks in terms of their experience, they come back after week 1, 70% come back, 70% come back week 2, 70% week 5, okay? If you increase acceptability by increasing the bricks to 80%, and you track that out, the gap in the middle here, this space here, is a 24% increase in demand. That's what the grape industry is going after. That's your competition. And essentially what it says is consistent quality will give you higher consumer acceptability, more trust, leading to higher loyalty. And we all know if a consumer goes into the store and they have a bad experience, it takes them further 4 to 6 weeks before the repeat purchase. It takes them a further 2 to 3 purchases before they have the same level of satisfaction prior to that dissatisfactory purchase. So if you get it wrong, you could be knocking your sales out for 8 weeks. And then it might be 24 weeks before they have that same level of loyalty back again. So just looking at the domestic market, and we say, look, all these opportunities are where we can sell fruit, and this is all the domestic, major retailers, food stores, food service, etc. Export is one that's quite interesting because you're coming off a really low base in apples. So when you look at this is 2018 data, but when you look at production of about 465 million, which is almost 70% going to fresh supply, you have 29% going to processing, 2% to export. A little bit of import coming in, but virtually nothing, only $2.9 million. This is a huge opportunity, this export, and I accept there's some challenges around access and protocols, but when you look at the traditional channel of export, which is through to your major exporters who then they take it and they deal with it and it happens, and I think Gavin touched upon this earlier today in your presentation from Lava, which is this is a business called James Tyler that is actually really clever in the sense that it's targeting community buying groups. So in the apartment blocks in China, you might have a mum who's got kids in school between 10 and 2. She'll run a business whereby she basically buys case of apples, and let's say it's $1 each for apple. She sells them on for $1.50 to the people in the building. And in these apartment blocks, there's 10 to 20,000 people. Yeah? These are massive, massive apartment blocks. These guys are sending oysters, fresh oysters, from Tasmania to these apartment blocks, which just demonstrates how robust the whole cool chain system is. But they've built this model whereby they can actually target these community blocks, bypass the HEMAs and the major retailers and how slow that is, and have a direct relationship with the end consumer. And what's good about it is they get immediate feedback in terms of consumer insights to say, well, what are consumers wanting, what's selling, what isn't selling, and how does that influence their decision-making moving forward? It will improve their decision-making. So there's some interesting opportunities in the export sector outside of the major traditional export channels by these more targeted routes, and really, really worth considering. So just conscious of time, so just going to go into now in terms of just summing up from the retail perspective, the likely tactics of the retailers moving forward. So this is really the battleground. This is where Australia is at the moment, okay? And, the first thing is that frugal, savvy consumer, the Aldi consumer, they ain't going away. They're here. We're a price-sensitive consumer base in Australia. So how does Coles and Woolworths combat Aldi? They've got to compete on price, but they've got to do it rationally. They've got to be within 5% of the private label range on their 1,500 SKUs in an Aldi store. And it's that perception. And it's going to be all these sorts of things. So it's the everyday low price, going away from high-low promotions, reducing needless choice. And that's where, we're talking about customer decision trees last year, optimum choice, balancing sales against loyalty, taking out choice if you don't, needless SKUs, you don't need it. These are the sort of things that are going to be, the retailers will have to compete on. When it comes to formats, we've seen the maturing of the Coles Local and the Woolworths Metro stores, and that's just these small format stores, so that's around smaller, more frequent shops, 50% people shopping daily in these stores. Core range, convenience, food to go. And interestingly, here, 34% of shoppers don't know what they're eating for dinner until 5 p.m. 34%, a third of consumers. And 50% don't have time to cook, which means they're tapping into this convenience, ready to eat. Really clever what Woolworths have done, their investment of $30 million into Marley Spoon. So HelloFresh, Marley Spoon, has everyone tried either of those or heard of them? Home delivery market, so meal box, you pay, and basically get sent to you, it's got a recipe instruction in, and in about 40 minutes, you can make a meal for four. If you've got teenage kids, it's brilliant. Give them the box, go for a walk. 40 minutes later, you should have dinner on the table. Brilliant. What's clever about this is that people are going, yeah. What's interesting about this is that Woolworths is essentially outsourcing their product innovation to a supplier at their cost. And in return, they're giving baseload volume to that supplier. And the opportunity here is that if you're a supplier to Woolworths, maybe you could be a supplier to Marley Spoon as well, because I'm sure that would be the next step in the evolution. Online, I haven't spoken about Amazon today at all, just due to time, but in terms of what's going to happen in online and the implications for you guys, is that what we're seeing is online contribution to sales growth is increasing. Now, what does that mean? So we can see here that today, FY19, about 50% of Coles' sales growth was due to online, whereas previously it was only 6% to 11%. Yeah? So online is becoming more important. As an omni-channel retailer, the majors have to play in online. They can't do an Aldi and say, I'm staying out of it, it's too hard, it's too expensive. They have to get involved. Otherwise, Amazon Fresh comes in and they'll own that space. So the spend for online purchases is much, much bigger. The basket size can be about 80% more. But the interesting thing about this is what's happening to Coles. And this is the same for Woolworths as well. So what we see here is that this is Coles food and liquor online penetration. It's around 3.3% at the moment. When it reaches 5%, 5% is thought to be the tipping point. So if you're less than 5%, you can do a store pick model. You can send people around the store picking for the online orders. If you're greater than 5%, you need a dedicated fulfillment center. Otherwise, you become operationally very inefficient. Coles have seen this happening, going, well, we're 3.3% now, so we better get ready. And they've just done this deal about 6 to 8 months ago with Ocado, the largest online grocery retailer. Phenomenal business. End-to-end operating solution, very profitable, 54,000 product lines. Coles has about 17,000, I think Woolworths about 20,000. So Coles can really double its product range easily. 50% of sales in fresh, very low cost of service, 12% of sales, which is really low. So they're saying £1.70 in the UK is the average cost of delivery paid by the consumer, like $4, yeah? Very, very cheap. And the automation and their ability to handle delicate product is pretty. That's a mango. It's pretty impressive. The challenge is what are the implications for apples? Are you going to get bruising in the supply chain? How's that going to work? What's it going to look like? How do you be a part of this? And just in summary, it is going to get tougher. This focus on cost, retailer competition's increasing. You guys are feeling more of that competition as well. The consumer is ever more inquiring about what they're getting as well. So the focus on low and cost won't go away. Absolutely critical to put the consumer first, leveraging trends, leveraging insights, understanding more about your consumer than anyone else can, and finally being different. The innovation, that could be supply chain innovation. Innovation is not necessarily the next variety of apple. It could be those other opportunities through the supply chain. How do you work together? How do you use pack houses in your existing capital to work more efficiently to deliver that result and essentially add value across everything you do? Thank you.
We've always thought that fresh produce was kind of exempt from the online shopping to some extent because, if you're buying dog biscuits or Coke, it makes sense. But if you want to choose your apple or your mango or whatever, then you can't do that online. But do you think that that's changing and that we're going to follow that more like the Chinese model where we just take it on trust?
Yeah, look, I think Australia's a little bit of an outlier because given our sort of European heritage, and I'm thinking particularly more the Mediterranean heritage of Italian Greeks, consumers here tend to be far more emotionally connected to produce. So they'll pick it up, smell it, hug it, interactive with their products. Whereas, say, the UK, which is a very similar market to here, people will just pick it up, plastic bags, and just chuck it in their basket and not worry too much about it. Yeah? So it's quite interesting that when it comes to online, the challenge will be if the likes of Amazon Fresh or Coles and Woolies don't get their systems right to give the right quality to the consumer, it'll take them a long time to win consumers back. So I think what you'll see is they'll be very, very well invested in that. And Amazon just recently announced they're investing a load of money into new technology to help them understand produce quality more accurately. Now, I think they're a long way away because, let's face it, produce industry has been doing that around the world for decades, and it's very, very difficult. So, but yeah, absolutely, the quality's going to be right, otherwise people won't trust online, for sure.
Okay. Tristan, thank you so much.
Welcome. Thank you.